mental health has gotten very popular over the last 10 years, especially. There's certainly the idea that people with mental illnesses are violent. That's just not true. Recovery is accessible to the vast majority of people. Recovery is actually expected and likely, especially when people get the help that they need. Then the rates of recovery go up way even further.
I'm Ali Horiad. My goal in this program is to educate our audience about various social and environmental global issues and on how we can help. Today, I'm pleased to speak with author and mental health advocate and fellow Canadian, Mark Henick. Hello, Mark. How are you?
Hi, Ali. I'm very well, thank you.
Welcome to the show. My first question for you is, you've written a book. I want to know what inspired you to write your memoir, so called Normal, a memoir of family, depression, and resilience.
Thank you for that. And it's such a privilege every time I get to talk about this book because it's my life story up to a certain point anyway. And it was really my way of trying to reconcile all of my childhood and adolescent struggles with mental illness and with suicidality. So that's what I try to do in the book is to unpack and to understand why I went through what I went through. It was really very therapeutic for me in that respect. So, I think taking all of that past experience, and it was bubbling up for me for years. I remember when I was in graduate school, I was living in Chicago. And I had a dream in the middle of the night where suddenly, and it was the first time it happened for some reason, I had this dream of a voice speaking to me, asking me to find him. And then for the next couple of weeks, I was wondering what on earth was that about until I finally started to unpack that it was, I think, a call from my subconscious to try to find this stranger who saved my life during a suicide attempt when I was only 15 years old. So I kind of just tucked it away for the longest time. And after I finished graduate school in Chicago, I moved to Toronto and settled here. I started working in mental health counseling with 16 to 24-year-olds who are experiencing their first episode of psychosis because I wanted to be who I needed when I was that age. I needed somebody who could not fix me or give me a diagnosis or the magic medication. I tried all those things, it felt like. I needed somebody who could actually understand me and help to connect me with through this incredibly confusing system that is the mental health care system. So all those things were sort of in the background. And as I was climbing the ladder in the mental health space in Canada, I got to a point where I had reached the national office of a community mental health organization, and I wasn't particularly happy because I wasn't telling my story in the authentic way that I really felt like I needed to. So I ended up talking to. I had made a lot of friends in media and in my public speaking circuit over that time. So I finally said to them, I think I'm ready to turn this into a book. We got a book deal right away, actually. HarperCollins Canada, my literary agent, didn't even have to send it to anybody else. They gave us a preemptive offer right away because they just wanted it so badly, which was an incredible validation, I think, for me,
No.
for the importance and the interest in this story. And then with that in hand, I ended up leaving my job and sort of just becoming a wandering writer for the next several years as I dragged all this out of myself. So I think the book was inspired. The book entirely revolved around not just my childhood struggles, but that transitionary period of trying to pull it out of myself in a therapeutic way for me, but in a way that would be helpful for other people too, to make my story make sense.
Okay. And obviously, I mean, your experiences with depression, mental health, and everything you went through influence your writing. I mean, you were kind of using it as maybe a release, or maybe somehow affecting yourself as well, as much as trying to put this out so you can help people. Can you tell me a little bit how writing influenced you and how it helped you cope?
Absolutely. So I think sort of the final push that I needed in many ways to actually write the book was the death of my mother. She died very suddenly, unexpectedly. Um, and for me, that was kind of, grief has this way of sending you back into the depths of crisis, is the best way to describe it, especially if it's a sudden death of that kind, of somebody that I cared so much about. But to really confront me with the fact that I had to make a change. I had to do something to honor her memory, and to sort of unpack the time that we spent together. So I think that was kind of a big motivating factor for me. And then the writing process itself was very much tied up with trying to grieve her death.
Mm.
I think that's what I was really doing in so many ways. So I had tried to write the book off the side of my desk, and I can get a little intense in my process, in my creative process. So I just wasn't able to do that. And that's, again, partly why I left the job too, because when I left sort of the 9 to 5 working world, I'd been building this consulting business on the side anyway. So that helped with it. But I needed to fully immerse myself in the writing process because I felt like I owed that to myself, and I owed that to the reader as well, to not just have this be, not that there's anything wrong with self-help books, but that's not what I was setting out to write. I was writing for myself. I was writing something that needed to be true, and first of all, true to me. So I went away to a Trappist monastery in the woods, and I lived there with the monks for that first time for more than a month, and then I went back with them several times actually after that. We went through 14 drafts or 15 drafts, I think, of the book. So all told, I spent months and months with these Trappist monks in the woods, and just really digging into myself. I wrote the book in a chronological kind of way, at least initially, because I felt like I needed to just go back to the beginning and really unpack step by step both what worked for me, but also what went wrong for me, and where things went sideways. Um, I think why that was so therapeutic was because it helped me to find the through line. It helped me to step back from sort of the mess of the struggles themselves, the individual sufferings, and to really sort of see the narrative arc, or at least to give it a narrative arc of some sort to make it make sense. So I think that's why it was so therapeutic for me, was that I was able to do that. I was able to pull myself out of the weeds, and give it a meaning, even if it didn't have it before. At least I could give it one now with what I've learned since.
Mm. And um, I like that you touched on this. You said, you had your consulting business that was picking up. You're able to leave the 9 to 5, and your approach to helping is not just like you said. Here's a self-help book. Go out and figure it out. You have speaking engagements, and you involve yourself in the community and all of that. And going to speaking engagements, I guess one of your famous talks, so to speak, is the TED Talk that millions have watched and relate to, really. And it's a very captivating story. I mean, you're there for 10 minutes, and as a viewer, you can't really walk away from it because you get so pulled in by what you're saying. As connecting with your audience, I want to know if, first of all, what are the common questions from your audience that you get often, that you feel like here's a repetitive thought process of the audience, and that's like the main points that you would touch on in terms of helping. And also, you know, what offbeat perspectives have you heard that you may say, I've never heard of this before, this one's new.
Yeah, there's not much I haven't heard, because, like you say, you do hear a lot of very similar questions when you do this type of work enough, and I think that's okay because, in fact, that's what shows us that most people are on the same page. That we're all feeling terribly alone, but we're all alone together. So it's like we're in these little isolated bubbles that are just bumping into each
Mm,
other. What if we could pierce those bubbles and actually make real connection, because we're already all around each other anyway? So I think in terms of some of the, I'll start with the first part of that question. Then you might have to remind me once I forget of the second part. But for the first part, some of the most common things that I get are things like, what do you wish people would have told you at the time, or what did you need at the time? And that was kind of in a lot of ways part of the point of the TED Talk was that yes, it was about my story, but it's not like they just found me on the sidewalk and I wandered out onto the stage and just sort of improved this trauma dumping. That's not what that was. At least it's not what it was intended to be. There were 6 months of prep work that went into that talk. And then a lot of it, I remember I was with my speaking coach beforehand in a dark little corner backstage. I was ready to throw up because suddenly I was nervous. I wasn't nervous before that, but right before you step onto that famous red dot, you get real nervous, it turns out. Um, and he told me, he gave me a great piece of coaching advice, which was just to talk about, don't recite the talk, just talk about what the talk is about. Tell me just the points, like kind of just what it's supposed to feel like. So that's what we did a few minutes before the talk. And then when I went out on stage, it was very close to what I had scripted anyway. But on the same hand, it wasn't anything like what I had scripted because I just delivered it. It's like I just threw the notes out in my head and just said what I wanted to say in the notes anyway, which happened to be very similar. But I think that's why it came out as so raw and cathartic for me. So I think that when I get around to or when people ask me what would have helped, part of the point of that talk was that idea of this perceptual collapse that happens when you're in crisis. That your ability to see people who can help you around you is variable. You can have the most obvious signs of help possible around you, but if the person isn't in the right headspace, the right mindset to be able to actually receive those signals of help, then it's not going to help. So that's why, as somebody in the case of suicide, though I think it happens in other mental health crises and other just mind states as well, but in the case of suicide specifically, you have to keep your messaging so direct, so simple, but not patronizing, but so you have to pierce through and grab the person by their humanity in order to really connect with them. Talking about the research and talking about clinical interventions and diagnostic schema and all this stuff that doesn't connect with people, these things that doctors and
Mhm.
psychiatrists, psychologists have all studied for a very long time to understand, they sometimes remind you, that doesn't always help because they just want to be with a real living human being. And that's why when I tell this story at the time of the man, the stranger in the light brown jacket, who actually literally physically reached out and pulled me off of that bridge, that's what I wanted to communicate. Was so necessary to help people literally, but also more so metaphorically, to really reach into their humanity and see them and feel them and build that kind of connection. So, at the time that I did that talk, I didn't know who that was. I later actually found out who he was and was able to finally thank him.
Yes, I heard about that part of it too, and that's the part we'll get to. Um, and with connecting with your audience, which was the second part of the question, what offbeat new perspective or something really strange? Tell me something there.
Yeah, thank you for reminding me of the second part of that. As you can tell, you give me an inch and I'll take a mile. I'm passionate about. I'm still, after all these years of doing this work, I'm still incredible. This is my favorite thing to talk about, even after talking about it for 20
Right.
years.
And that's
Anyway,
what being a compassionate activist is, right? That's why you're on Compassiviste Dialogues, because that's what it's about, bringing people who are really passionate and compassionate about their causes, and not just trying to, like we said earlier, sell a book or say something like that. And I really believe that you're
yeah.
passionate and you're making a difference in the world. So I love having this conversation.
Well, I think it's a good fit for it then. But in terms of and if you need to shut me down, just ask me about calculus or something. I don't have much to say on that. But
Fair enough.
in terms of some of the offbeat things that I've been asked, I nothing immediately comes to mind in terms of examples there, but I think that in itself is an example because um, you hear so. I love hearing the individual iterations, not just on people's struggles and how they wrestle with mental illness, but on how they figure out how to get through it, and how scrappy they get, the little strategies that people find for managing things, when they might happen to have suicidal thoughts, or if they're feeling that they're sliding back into addiction again, or whatever it is. Just the little ways that people find hope in the world. The people that they see on the sidewalk who smile at them in that certain way, or the distractions they find in their hobbies,
Mhm.
or their interests. Those are the little stories that I get when I walk off stage that keep me talking to people for longer than the talk itself. There's always the talk after the talk where,
Right.
you're talking to just dozens of people one on one. And those are the things that I really love the most about this work, because there's that old saying that in the most particular you'll find the most universal. And I think that's a good encapsulation of what I do, is that I go up there and I tell my one particular story. I'm not really trying, although it's always in the background, I'm not really trying to make it a sermon or make it a lesson for anybody to follow. It's like I'm
Mhm.
not, and I vehemently resist when people identify me as any kind of expert. I'm no expert. I'm hardly an expert in my own life, let alone anybody else's. So, I think that um, when people hear other people who don't have any kind of ulterior motive, they're just there being real with them, it gives them permission, it gives them license to be real like that with themselves and with others. Not that they need that permission. So that's what I think I like. Although I've had lots of unusual speaking experiences over the years where I've been called in to talk with a room full of 5,000 steel workers, or literally on a soapbox in a high school gym, or different. I did one for travel agents in California just this past fall. So that's been fun, where I've gotten a speaking request for something that most people would say, how does that relate to mental health? How are you going to find the angle there? And every single time it's like, oh, these are my favorite events to do, because it's almost a challenge. And you realize that there's nothing that doesn't relate to mental health in some way or another.
That's very
So I
true.
think those little surprises, yeah, those little surprises have been my favorite
Mhm.
my favorite experiences.
The connecting of the dots, so to speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, to you personally, can you take me through a 15-year-old in the midst of an episode, a suicidal episode, all the way to you here now in feeling recovered, feeling healthy, feeling in control of all the things that you need to be able to do the work that you're doing? What was that transition like, and how did you really push through? Why didn't you fail?
Yeah, I think the TLDR here, the too long didn't read, is that it's messy and up and down with lots of hills and valleys and moments where you don't realize you're moving forward. I think that's the short version. The longer version is that after that night on the bridge that I shared in my TED talk, we can start there, because there was a lot that went into. I didn't just uh, get a mental illness infection overnight one day. There was a lot that brought me to that bridge, which I explore in my book. That was the primary focus of my book. But starting from there, after that stranger saved my life, I think in some small way, his presence, as contrasted with, as I talk about in that talk, these strangers who stood on the sidelines and shouted out for me to jump, I think that it embedded in my mind, really for the first time, or at least in the first salient way, that two different people could look at the same situation in two different ways and respond in two different ways. And for me, that was a revelation as a 15-year-old, mentally ill, suicidal kid. It was like, oh, I don't have to see the world this one black and white way that my depression tells me I need to see it. That there are actually, if these two people can see it differently, why can't I? So it wasn't that revelatory in the moment, but that's kind of what I've traced it back to, and that's really what motivated me then to the first step, share and open up about my own story. The stigma was worse than the symptoms. I say that all the time. Feeling the shame of not being able to be myself and to open up because it made other people uncomfortable when somebody else was suffering. So you had to be very private about it because you don't want to be impolite and tell other people that you're suicidal or depressed. That's almost the sense of it, that you're an inconvenience or a burden. And there's lots of good psychological research now to suggest too that that's a mechanism of action in completed suicide, is when somebody feels that overwhelming sense of being a burden when combined with a number of other factors like hopelessness, helplessness, mental illness. Um, so I needed to open up about my story. I went to my high school principal. I told them I wanted to share with my peers. My high school principal said no, because when you talk about suicide, it gives people the idea to do it. It's another persistent myth. It's not true. It's been studied over and over again. There's constructive and not so constructive ways of talking about suicide, for sure. But talking about it doesn't give people the idea to do it. In fact, it increases the likelihood that they'll reach out for support. So we even had a bit of that research then. So I started finding out and learning more and more about it. Like so many times in my life, the big things that I've done really were motivated in some ways by being told that I couldn't or that I shouldn't. So it was almost this contrarian sort of urge to prove them wrong, to prove that I could do it, which I think worked out in my favor. Um, so I wrote a letter to my local newspaper, a letter to the editor, in which I opened up about my own experiences. And at first, I was afraid. Before I did that, I was afraid that people would treat me differently, that they would ostracize me and alienate me because I'm opening up about this stuff. And the exact opposite happened. I
Hmm.
started getting people, even family members and teachers and friends, who started sharing their story with me too, because I opened up about mine. And that for me was just a magical experience. That was really the catalyst that started everything for me. Was getting that positive feedback. That when you open up, it lets other people open up too. So I went off to undergraduate school. I was the first in my immediate family to get an undergraduate degree, to go off to college. That was a transformative experience for me, because I went, I think in part because I went to a liberal arts college that really valued critical thinking. And their tagline at the time, just their marketing tag at the time, was "Question everything." I ended up studying philosophy in part as well, and that was that Socratic method ended up being incredibly therapeutic for me as well. So it was an accident that I happened to stumble into that. I went off to graduate school to study child development and developmental psychology, because I wanted to understand my own development as a child. So
Right.
so much of this journey was me trying to unpack my own trauma and my own issues. So it's been personal all the way down. Moving back to Toronto after the degree, and working in community mental health, and going into people's homes, meeting with kids in coffee shops and their cars, or going for walks on the sidewalk to talk about mental health. I didn't do that with any of the people, any of the doctors or counselors who tried to help me. I'm not a doctor, but it was always in their consulting room, in their little doctor's office. It was never at a Tim Hortons coffee shop, or going for a walk along the sidewalk. So we really did mental health on the ground. We met people literally where they were. So that was a profound lesson for me, for what people need and how people need to recover. And then, really writing the book and doing the speaking circuit and getting and doing so much media and things like that really showed me that idea that um, m- people need these messages of hope and recovery. That the messages about the reality of the struggle, those are necessary too. But I think we have to remember that the vast majority of people who struggle with mental illnesses get better. Recovery is not some abstract concept available only to some people. Recovery is actually expected and likely, especially when people get the help that they need. Then the rates of recovery go up way
Hmm.
even further. But this is something that you never hear mental health professionals talk about, partly because I think there's a vested interest there. Sometimes people get better on their own.
Yes.
A surprising number of people just figure it out. That's not a treatment strategy that I'd ever recommend to anybody. But I think that really within that is packed so much hope for me about the innate potential that people already have, that they're already good enough. They're already strong enough just as they are. They don't need anybody to give them the secrets of the
Right.
universe, that they already have the skills they need to get better if only we could support them in unfolding them. So that was very much, I think, I guess that's very much my own story as well, was that my recovery unfolded very gradually. There were lots of missteps and mistakes and struggles along the way, times where I didn't even know that I was recovering until well after. But ultimately, it's one of those things where you don't realize how far you've come until you actually stop, take a breath, and look back.
And in that answer, you touched on three things that I want to kind of open up a little further. And those are the misconceptions about mental health and the support that people would seek, and the importance of your support group. So let's start briefly with misconceptions. What would you say are these big myths? Like you mentioned a few, and you used the word myths, and there are myths out there about mental health,
Hmm.
and a lot of people, unfortunately, one of the ones I can start you off with is thinking that you cannot recover, thinking that it's a forever
Yeah.
thing. So let's start there.
This is probably my biggest one, because it's one that you often don't hear about. Often, especially in sort of pop mental health
Mm,
kind of dialogue, and mental health. A lot of people don't like when people say this either, but mental health has gotten very popular over the last 10 years, especially. With more and more celebrities talking about it, with more charities, more people in this space, it's definitely gotten more popular to talk about. But that's one of the things you'll hear, all these myths about antidepressants and diagnoses. There's certainly the idea that people with mental illnesses are violent. That's just not true. It's been researched over and over and over again. It's just no more likely to be violent than anybody else. So that's one. But they're very often about signs and symptoms and diagnoses, sort of personality characteristics, but very few people talk about that recovery one. The reality that recovery is accessible to the vast majority of people. And in fact, it's to the degree where um, I think that when we see people who have not recovered in terminal cases of terminal mental illness, like suicide, or when we see people who have been struggling with a mental illness or with poor mental health for 20, 30, 40 years, we point to that and say, look, that's proof that we couldn't do anything. I disagree. I think that's proof that we failed to do anything, that we as a society, as a healthcare system, that we failed to help those people. Suicide is preventable, and for the majority of people, if we can actually access them early enough, like I said before, people don't just magically out of nowhere become suicidal. Some people think they do because suicidal people learn to hide it so well, but there's a whole trail that often leads up to it. And if we can actually learn to better identify what that is and when it peaks, that time piece is particularly important, it seems. Then we can better prevent suicide. We know if we give people access to better housing, employment, food security, that helps to reduce suicide. So I think that it's a myth that the only way we can prevent suicide is to build more barricades in public infrastructure, to do more crisis lines, to have more emergency rooms and secure mental health wards. Those all play an important part of the system. I'm not for a second saying we shouldn't have those. We should. But if you want to prevent suicide, you're too late if you're already doing those kinds of things.
mhm.
That all you're doing then is trying to fix the aftermath, or to intervene after the ball's already in the pocket. You have to go way earlier and intervene before people shut down into that place. So I think that's the key one. That's the key one for me. This idea that we can't help people. That piece around violence is just flat out wrong. That idea that we can't talk about suicide publicly, we can, in fact. And a lot of people are worried. I hear this all the time as a public speaker in this space. A lot of people are worried about triggering others. That is a valid concern. It should be. Suicide conversations have to be had safely. We have to talk about hope. We have to talk about recovery and resources that are available. But just the S word alone is not a trigger that we need to get hyper aware of. And in fact, when we do, there's a considerable amount of research coming out just in the last couple of years. There was just a big meta-analysis earlier this year, which showed that that can actually be unhelpful to plant anticipatory anxiety in people by saying up front, this is going to be really hard, this is going to be scary, this is going to be yada,
Hmm.
yada,
Hmm.
yada. That's actually not a constructive way to talk about
Right.
suicide, that it plants the seed that you're supposed to feel anxious about
Right.
this. You don't have to. We can all just have a connected, real conversation, and then ensure that people have the supports that they need and they feel comfortable and not pressured to share their story if they don't want to. Those boundaries are key too, I think.
Okay. And I like that you brought up the, I guess, policy aspect of it, because I see this very often too, and I see it in even developing countries. I was recently in Dubai, in United Arab Emirates, and they have a metro system now, which wasn't there 20 years ago. So it's a relatively new subway infrastructure, and they have the glass barriers that the doors only open into the train, so nobody can jump off in front of a train. And so it's a preventative measure. But to me, when I look at that, I say, you're preventing one method of this space. You're not actually preventing the thought process of suicide, which is what you
Right.
said. And so, where is that government arm that is supposed to come in and say, no, no, no? It's not about taking the Don Valley Bridge and covering it in spikes and in all sorts of barbed wire. It's about, why is that person looking to go there in the first place? Why aren't we stopping
Yeah.
the person from
Well,
reaching that bridge, right? That's where we need to step in, not at that point. So um, we
yeah.
don't have that. And a lot of countries don't even have public health care. In Canada, where you are, although part of it is not covered by your OHIP in Ontario or any other provincial healthcare system, but even parts that are, it's just insufficient. And in parts of the world, there's absolutely no support. So it's mental health issues, dealing with them is becoming severely an unequal access space, and it's becoming really, really an inequality issue. You're rich, you can
It
have
is.
access. You're not rich, you better figure it out on your own, just like many
Well,
people
this
do.
is it. I mean, Canada gets held up as having this universal healthcare system all the time. Canada does not have a
No.
universal mental health care system. The interventions that we know work the best, specifically psychotherapy, are completely out of
Hmm.
reach of most people at $200, $300 an hour
Yes.
with a qualified therapist. And then often we don't have enough of those professionals anyway because people can't afford to access them.
Right.
So the market isn't there. But I want to touch briefly though on what you mentioned about the barricades. I am, even though I absolutely 100% agree that we need to go further upstream in order to prevent people from going there, I think it's both and. We need to have those types of infrastructure projects too, because when you mentioned the Bloor Street Viaduct, which here in Toronto, where I'm
Hmm.
located, used to be the second leading
Yes.
suicide hotspot in North America after the Golden Gate Bridge. When they built what's called the Luminous Veil, which is a suicide barricade, it took years, a decade or more, for the city council to actually get the funding and the organization together to do it. But after they built it, it worked. And one of the criticisms, or one of the myths, I think, that people that held up that project a little bit was that people would just go to a different bridge. And this was studied by a researcher as well here in Toronto at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Center, and he found that by and large they didn't. There's another bridge like 2 kilometers
Yes.
away, and generally they didn't. And so it's all about, just like subway barricades. I've been very publicly supportive of the idea that Toronto, which has an extensive subway system when it works, they have. I'm a big advocate for the fact that they need platform doors here too. Just the investment or the improvement in service reliability alone pays for the project, let alone all the human lives that
Yes.
you're going to save. because suicide is very much in the moment impulsive.
Hmm.
There's a lot of mental stuff that goes into it that predisposes that person. But when you think of it, there's lots of people who are walking along the subway platform or who live near that particular bridge or whatever the suicide hotspot is, who are in that perfect storm in their mind that they then have means accessible. As it relates to a US audience, this is why we know gun control is such a powerful suicide prevention measure, because the majority of gun deaths in America are
Hmm.
suicides. The idea there is that they're easily accessible. So when people are in that mindset and they have that impulse, they know where to go. So these are some those are policy decisions that can be made that help to prevent people from acting on those
Hmm.
impulses. But then we have to do the other part too, and
Yes.
this was the biggest lesson of the deinstitutionalization era that followed from Kennedy's Mental Health Act that led to shutting down so then called insane asylums across North America, around the world. The Kennedy work was a small piece of that, because Kennedy also called for community
Hmm.
health care. That was the part of the equation that didn't get filled in. So they shut down so many inpatient treatment centers, which was a good thing to do. People don't get better in hospitals. They warehouse them at that time, especially, and to an extent still today. In inpatient care, where they take away their rights very often to care for themselves. But then the idea was supposed to be you shut those down and you build up a community system of care instead. And that other side of it didn't happen. So now, as a result, we see people who are disproportionately homeless. We know that our prison population, people with severe and persistent mental illnesses, are overrepresented, and we have suicide rates, which are climbing in most jurisdictions. So I think that's kind of the fallout here: is that if you take care away and you don't substitute it with anything, then of course the crisis that we're seeing in mental health right now at the societal level, of course of course we're going to be where we are. Just like I discovered in my own story when I looked at all the pieces that went into play for my own crisis. When I looked at my own personal history, I thought to myself, of course, why didn't anybody see this coming? I can see it right here in the medical records spread out on this big table, that this trajectory is so obvious. I think that applies at the macro level to societies too. It's no wonder why we're struggling the way we are when we're investing in the wrong priorities.
Hmm. It's very true, and also the stigma, like you said. We're not investing in that, in clearing that either, because you mentioned celebrities earlier in the talk, and I remember a tennis player, an American Japanese tennis player on the tennis professional tennis tour, and she decided to take some time off for mental health. And there was a lot of backlash because she makes a lot of money, she's popular, and all. There was a lot of backlash, and my first thought was, if she had twisted her ankle on a serve return in a game and took 3 months off to recover, would there be backlash? No, because it's a
Yeah.
physical issue. But now that it's a mental issue, it could be just as severe as a torn ligament. But because we don't see it, it's not tangible, and we don't have a history of appreciating these issues. We say, oh, why is she taking time off? She's vacationing, she made too much money, she doesn't care about the tour, she doesn't care about tennis. So much came out, and there was this huge backlash, and I think she went off social media for a while because of a lot of that. And so I think, like you said, the barricades, yes, of course, I'm all for it, but we really need to invest money in a lot of the other things to be able to do that, to be able to support, and that support. Going to the next part of what I wanted to ask you is the family or support group. In your case, in your experience, you're 15 years old, you are pulled back from the ledge. From that moment on, I would assume, you're pulled back, you didn't go through, maybe the police showed up, maybe an ambulance came, maybe nothing happened, you just walked home. But where did you find support? I mean, at 15, it's really difficult to say, yeah, just going to go take a shower, wake up, and go to school tomorrow. Something must have happened, and someone must have kind of, I don't know, hugged you or cried or something. Tell me.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I largely didn't. So when that man pulled me off the bridge, it had turned out that the police had arrived. They had barricaded the bridge. The crowd, even though it was midnight on a Sunday night and a cold Sunday night in March, crowds had gathered at the barricades, because in small towns, people listen to the police
Yes.
radios to see if there's any, action happening,
Yes.
something to talk about. So crowds had gathered, and um, after he pulled me off of the bridge, they put me into the ambulance. They brought me back to the hospital. I'd already been to the hospital half a dozen times, well, admitted half a dozen times before. I'd been a dozen or more times otherwise. They admitted me for a 24-hour stay and discharged me the next day. Um, Nobody came to pick me up. It was just when I pulled the discharge report for the book, because I pulled all my medical records. I wanted to make sure I got that part of my book right. They just noted in the discharge summary that they were going to leave my file open because I was probably going to be back anyway. So, I had become a frequent flyer of the system, somebody for whom the more help they need, the less help they get. Suicide attempts are a desperate attempt
Mhm.
for people to try to get help for themselves, I
Yes.
think. They feel helpless. Now, the irony of it, I guess, in a way, or the paradox of it is that they already probably have the tools that they need inside them, and that's not what they're seeing. That nobody can do recovery to you. You can't inject recovery into somebody. That's something you got to do the work yourself. But we need a supportive network of family, friends, professionals who can help to scaffold that recovery process, to meet you where you are. So, okay, you can just barely get out of bed today. That's fine. We can meet there and we can help you with that. And then maybe tomorrow or next week or next month, we'll do the next step and do a little bit more. That's the kind of learning process, I think, that recovery really takes. I didn't have anybody to do that with me. I had people help here and there along the way to the best of their ability, but I always describe my own recovery as just a scrappy, messy way to figure it out as I went. And to be honest, I'm not sure I've met many people, and I've met thousands and thousands of people, particularly on the public speaking circuit. We were talking before about sort of the talk after the talk, and,
Hmm.
and meeting with and talking with people after. I could maybe I could maybe think of a half, about one hand, count on one hand, the number of people who came up to me and said that they reached out for help. The doctor knew exactly what to do. They got on a treatment plan and they got better. That is, to go back to the myths. I think that's actually one of the most toxic myths that the mental health field communicates to people. You just reach out for help and then things will get better. That's often not the case. For very few people is that the case. You reach out for help. Sometimes the person that you reach out to isn't the right person. Sometimes they're not going to understand you. They're not going to give you the help that you need. Especially if you're from a marginalized group, if you're homeless, if you're racialized, a member of the LGBTQ community, if you have anything that mismatches you from traditional care, in some ways, if you have exclusionary criteria, as they're called, then you're not going to get the help that you need. Does that mean that you shouldn't get help? No, absolutely not. It just means, I think, this is what I've learned from needing to have scrappy recovery, is that you have to learn to be your own best advocate. You have to learn to self advocate for what you need. That if you're in a therapeutic relationship that isn't working, whether it's with a psychiatrist or or a psychotherapist or anybody else, you need to be able to vocalize that. If you are with an employer who isn't supporting your mental health, you need to be able to vocalize that, and to do so in a way that affects change. You don't have to be prickly with everybody about it. That
Hmm.
often doesn't work anyway. Um, but you have to learn how to speak up for your own needs in a constructive way, and realizing that you might tell that family member that you're having a hard time and they might not understand. They might not say the most helpful thing. That's not on you. That's
Mm.
their stuff. You have to be able to separate between your stuff and their stuff, right? um, they might get there at some point where they're able to really understand you and relate empathetically to you, but until then you have to find somebody else who can, I think. So that's part of, I think, what I try to at least implicitly communicate to people is that you can't have tried everything, because as long as you're trying, you're trying new things.
Hmm.
And I think that's how it works. You're going to hit roadblocks. Resilience isn't about how you stay up all the time or how you move through the system perfectly or whatever. Resilience is about how you get back up every time you fall. Mindfulness is about how you come back to your breath every time you forget about it. You just keep coming back to your breath. And I think of that as a good analogy for recovery too, is that as many times as you fall down, you get back up, and you keep going.
Okay. And speaking of, the way you position that, in the fact that it's very true, and I seldom hear this, and I'm very happy and actually proud of you for saying this. You say you don't just recover by reaching out to a professional. You don't go into a hospital and you come out changed. There's no injection that's going to fix it. And that's beautiful that you say that. If Mark tomorrow is mayor of Toronto, and you went and
God help us.
well, if Mark was mayor of Toronto tomorrow, and you were going to open up the mental health portfolio, you're going to pull it off the shelf and say, we need to look at this, we need to make some changes, we need to move it forward. And what would you do? What would you say from the perspective of the individual communities, organizations, and the government? Because a lot of the global audience will not know. Like you said, again, another myth that Canada has a universal health system.
Hmm.
In fact, a lot of the leading families of Canada are the people who maintain the health care system in Canada with
Hmm.
ridiculous donations that you don't see in much other parts of the world. And I think it's, um, this heritage and this responsibility that they take upon themselves. Because I've spoken with some of them, and I've known and worked with some of them, and they feel responsible to maintain this equality, to maintain this access, to maintain this oneness in Canada, that we are all equal as Canadians. We have access to all the same things as Canadians. And so they invest and they support. And it becomes really depressing in a sense to see that the more you do, the more the policies don't support the support of the community. So what will you change? What would you say this is where we need to come in mental health?
Well, specifically on that piece of it, I've seen so many times where some wealthy Canadian high net worth individual donates a lot of money, they get their name on the building, they do all that stuff. And I've had experiences both as a clinician, taking kids often, or adults as well, to these places with this big philanthropist name on the wall, or on the building. And I've also had the experience of doing it myself, with people that I love, taking them to these places that have so much money in the big splashy announcement affiliated with them, where the care is still substandard. Where you walk in the door and you're like, really? This is what all those millions and millions of dollars is paying for. I can get better customer service when I'm buying socks at the Gap than I can at this most vulnerable place in my life, or this person's life, where there's nobody even smiling at me. Nobody's asking me how I'm doing. I feel like I'm just a cog in a wheel on a conveyor belt through a fix-it factory for my mind. And then you can't even get connected with care anyway, right? They'll admit you to hospital, make sure you're safe, maybe, but then that's it. Then you're going to be on a waiting list for 6 months,
Mm,
12 months
mhm,
for community care, which may or may not even be the community care that you need. It might not even be the type of help that you need. So that's where I would intervene first. Is every door is the right door. It doesn't matter if somebody presents at hospital, if they go through their school, if they talk to somebody in the city. Ideally, there is nominally a single access point here in Toronto and province wide, actually in Ontario, where if you have a mental health issue, you can call them. Doesn't work that way, though, of course. So ideally, wherever people are, they can tell somebody in a position of authority, even if it's their family doctor. They should be the front line of this, and they get put in and required to be matched with somebody who can help them navigate the system right away,
mm,
because there are hundreds of mental health care providers just in Toronto alone. And it's like this in any
mhm,
major metropolitan
mhm,
area. At the community level, there are hundreds of organizations doing different things for different diagnoses with different criteria. They treat different ages, they have different wait lists. It's an incredibly inefficiently managed system that has cropped up all over the place. It's very loosely regulated. We just recently, or within the last few years, got a new college of psychotherapists, which regulates psychotherapy. Previously, psychologists and, of course, medical doctors were the only ones to do that. But now that we have a college of psychotherapists, that adds a good layer, I think, of accountability for some of the professionals that you're getting access to. But most people, their only option is to present to emergency room to talk to their doctor and have their condition treated very medically, and that doesn't work for actually most people, according to research. It clogs up the system for when you have people who could have been addressed, could have had their issues addressed in a much different way. It clogs up the system and prevents people with more severe and persistent mental illnesses from actually getting the help that they need, because they too face these kinds of waiting lists. So one access point, or every door leads to, where people can get connected with a system navigator, and then they, even if they have to wait for specialist services, that's okay, as long as it's a therapeutic waiting period. So they should be doing something during that waiting
Hmm.
period that actually helps them to recover. And so much of this, I've mentioned it a few times now, so much of this comes back to funding evidence-based psychotherapy as medically necessary, because we know that the research shows that for the vast majority of cases of the biggest diagnoses, depression and anxiety, psychotherapy works better than meds do. That's just meds are way cheaper. So you go to your family doctor and you walk out with a prescription. Most antidepressant prescriptions are written by family doctors, not by
Hmm.
psychiatrists. And then you're just sent on your way. And it's sort of a set it and forget it kind of approach very often. There are some really great docs out there who don't do that, who are much more involved and have a more hands on approach and a more empathetic approach. But the reality of the system is that's how it works for most people. People are not getting connected, especially kids, with the type of help that they need. They're not getting combination therapy, which are meds and psychotherapy, which works way better than just meds alone. And that's a policy issue. That's an access issue.
Right.
So I think as mayor, I'd be hiring salaried mental health professionals who are qualified, registered psychotherapists, who would be helping to alleviate the suffering on people. And we already have thousands of social workers, of people with psychology backgrounds, people with a variety, psychiatric nursing backgrounds. We have thousands of people who are already qualified to do this work, who
Hmm.
are waiting on the sidelines to do it, but that people can't afford to see, or they don't know that they
Exactly.
can see. So that's where I think we could be intervening at the bottom tier of the pyramid more effectively, rather than sending all the money to the places that really should be best helping the top of the pyramid, the people
Hmm.
with the most severe and
Hmm.
persistent illnesses. We got to help them too, but people will become less severe. Not as many people are going to get to the top of the pyramid if we address them lower
Yes,
on the pyramid
exactly.
instead.
Exactly. You're absolutely right on that. And I hope that people can come together and work together to um, advocate for this and try to place it into action. Now, you speak a lot
Well,
about
and I'll
this.
also
Yeah.
mention, and I know I've gone on and on about this, but we need to have standards. First of all, we need to better data on our mental health
Hmm.
interventions. Right now, we do a very poor job of tracking even basic data in the mental health space, and we need to have limits on wait times. It's absolutely unacceptable that a kid is waiting 18 months to
Hmm.
see even just a psychiatrist, let alone anybody else, when I guarantee you that they're going to be worse. Their presenting problems are probably going to be worse by the end of that 18
Yes,
months
definitely.
than had they just been treated upfront by somebody else even. So we need to have standards on wait times that are strictly enforced. We're failing people, I think, in that respect.
You're absolutely right there. I cannot argue with you there because I noticed that happening, and it's happening across the field in healthcare, specifically in Canada and in some other countries with universal healthcare, with growing populations and just policies and structures that don't match the growth. We're booming and building all these new subdivisions and homes and bringing in all these car dealerships to support that growth and supermarkets and whatnot, but then how many more doctors and how many more healthcare facilities and such are we actually investing in providing these people? And I think we shouldn't grow if we cannot present that as well. It's kind of like, yeah,
Well, and individual citizens are more productive. They generate more for the
yes,
economy when
yeah,
they're
when they're
mentally healthy.
healthy.
So that's a good argument
Exactly.
for it
Yes,
too.
exactly. When they're healthy, that's, what I was going to say is, you're bringing healthy people into the community. You're going to have a healthier community, which means a more efficient community. So for capitalism, that's
Yeah.
beautiful because it's, efficiency is key. And so I think you're right on all of those points. And now you bring up resilience. And you say it's important, and you say people need to cultivate resilience and kind of build that up. And I think what I want to ask you, controversially, is, do you think it's a generational perspective, in the sense that you, as a 15-year-old to a 25-year-old, grew up at a time when really the mental health space was opening up for the first time? As you said, from the pre-Kennedy era to now, I mean, it's a world of a difference. What a child can say today is a world of a difference than what a child can say 100 years ago, and the reactions of what that comes up to. And so, do you think that resilience was something that you had to really build up a lot of when you were, for example, a child 30, 50 years ago, 70 years ago? Because being bullied, just a simple example, being
Mm.
bullied was accepted in a sense in the school. Whereas today, it's really, really, at least we try to really regulate that and check it when it happens and have severe consequences for it. So, do you think it maybe the trajectory of the world that we're in terms of mental health, that things are changing, that we may not have to rely on resilience. I may not have to ensure that I'm a black belt in karate or something like that to avoid being bullied, as opposed to society is going to change and kids are going to become less bullisome because they understand and they're relating and
Mm.
they're learning, and through education and opening these fields up for kids to understand better, that resilience can drop? Or do you think, no, regardless, even if the support groups are more empowered and healthier themselves to understand these issues and educated on them and to be able to really support in a way that helps a person go through their issues, that we still need to be fully resilient and we need to go get that black belt in resilience?
Yeah, this is a great question. Because I've heard, especially among progressive thinkers and speakers, this idea that we shouldn't be pushing resilience so much because instead we should fix the problems that are requiring people to be resilient. I don't disagree with that. Um, However, I think that uh, while we're waiting for the world to be perfect,
Mhm.
we need to teach people how to bounce back, because resilience is, like I said before, resilience is not about things being great all the time. Resilience, by definition, is dealing with the times when things go sideways.
Mhm.
Now, we absolutely do need to do a better job than we did in the 50s and other in our parents' generations, of protecting people from assault, which is what bullying sometimes can be. I'm not just talking about some gentle teasing or whatever. Any parent, I think, has those conversations with their kids, especially when they get into late elementary school, middle school, maybe high school too, where they say, maybe that person is feeling badly about themselves, or just because they said those things, it doesn't mean it's true. That's good parenting. It's those kinds of conversations aren't what I'm talking about. When kids are afraid to go to school,
Mhm.
that's something that needs to
Mhm.
be addressed. If you're afraid to go to work because you're going to be sexually harassed,
Yes.
that's something that needs to be addressed. Obviously, that's not a resilience issue. That's a legal issue.
Right.
um, so I think that we hear this all the time when uh, people think that we have that it's all or nothing, that we have to go all resilience or all social change. And I think it has to be both. We can make the world a better place and need to continue making the world a better place while we still live with the fact that it's not. and that we need to be able to get up every morning and repair ourselves and help others in that way. So, I guess it's this old idea of keeping your heart open in hell. How do you keep yourself compassionate
Hmm.
and caring and loving and desiring of a better world, while still recognizing that there's stuff in this world that we're probably not going to change in our lifetimes. And that's how I think of um, the mental health movement is very kind of evolutionary or developmental,
Right.
generational like that. That at least if we're all becoming more empathetic together, then it's a net win. With the recognition that there's competing demands out there. Not everybody agrees that everybody needs to be better, needs to be more mentally healthy or more resilient, or that we even need a better world. There's always going to be competing interests out there. So I think that that's how we become more mentally healthy as individuals as well, and as a society, is recognizing that we're going to encounter people and things that attempt to compromise that, but that we can still be okay. So I guess that's kind of maybe a bit of an equivocal answer on that, but I think we need to continue building resilience while continuing to fight for a more compassionate world.
Okay. And that being a call to action for the future, would you say that is what, at least, in your personal experience, Canada and North America need to become, to get over this crisis? I call it a crisis because it is a crisis. So, not to use a harsh word, but the mental health crisis is actually a crisis. And what would you say? Would you say that's a good call to action, to build up resilience, to build up community support, to build up education to fight this, or is there something stronger?
I think that's part of it, but I think we also need to develop a broader, more holistic, more sophisticated understanding of what mental health is and who people are. When we struggle, um, the impulse is to just treat that as a brain disorder. And that's part of it for sure. Obviously, you can't experience anything without your brain. That your brain is your experience. Everything
Right.
has to go through that. But there's more to it than that. Is a person homeless because of their brain disorder? No. Is a person poor because of their brain disorder? No. It's there's other um, what are called the social determinants of health that are as powerful, if not more powerful, than your genes or your brain. And I think that we don't really yet have a full kind of at the generalist kind of society level, we don't have a full grasp of that. So I guess that would be my other piece of it, is that we need to have a broader, longer view of what constitutes good mental health, and that there's many ways to help people recover.
And in following those, where do you find yourself? I mean, you're here, book, talk, advocating, supporting, helping, being there in the community, doing all this. Where do you see yourself falling in this space? What are you doing, and what are your aspirations for the future? How do you see yourself if you were leaving a legacy? Where would you want that to be?
Oh, I mean, I don't think too much about my legacy. I think I just go out there and share what's on my mind. But maybe that is the legacy: is that I think we can all serve to be at least a little bit more authentic in our day-to-day interactions, where we're not so transactional all the time.
Right.
Where we're not just cultivating a relationship to get something out of it,
Hmm.
or we're not advocating for a particular point of view because that's the organization we work for, or that's the discipline that we've been trained in. I find that utterly boring when people just preach to
Right.
their own choir.
Right.
I think if we're being authentic, we're just moving through the world, sharing our story, and we're not afraid of that. There's no risk of that. I think that's where we need to move toward, where people can just be themselves and be celebrated for being themselves, assuming they're not harming anybody.
Hmm.
Um, just bring your whole self to the table, and that's really what builds and fortifies the connections that we need to protect our mental health.
And that happens from one person to another. And you kind of share my view there because when I did philosophy at school, like you, I got into Spinoza, who's a Dutch philosopher, and he had this view of God and the universe that I really started relating to. And then I figured out the word legacy to me didn't really mean, where is Ali Oriat's statue going to be one day, where people come and visit and say, that is the great man who did this. And no, my legacy definition would be, what momentum are you pushing after you're gone? After you're gone, what is continuing in a good way that you were the force behind that? And so, I have my ideals that I want to reach on that momentum to leave that legacy. And it would never be in my name. It would be in that momentum of that passion and compassion. And you're
Mm,
saying almost the same thing. You're saying it's not about the statue of Mark Henick somewhere in Toronto and a park named after him or street, and being in some history book or some mental health history book that, in the early days of expansion into mental health, Mark Henick did such and such. No. But what you want exactly, me and you can laugh at that. But a lot of people look at that and say, yes, exactly. I want my name there. I want this prescription to be
yeah.
named after, Hennick pill or something. But you're saying we need to come together and we need to be one. And
Yes.
in that oneness, we can move forward. And that is
Yeah, I
that is a
think so. You
beautiful
know,
thought.
when my mother died, I remember in the few days after, which were it was such a traumatic time, but I remember talking to my brother, my sister, different family members, and by the end of a few days later, by the end of the funeral, I came to this realization that they all knew her. They all knew a different version of her,
Mm,
but they all felt love for her. I found that to be such a powerful realization that she loved each of them and they each loved her in their own individual ways. They didn't love some statue that everybody knew the same one
exactly.
of.
You're right.
that it was almost like these um, many versions of love. And that's what I think. I think that can be all of our legacy, right? Is
Hmm.
just to interact with each individual person you encounter, as Ram Dass said, as though they were God in drag.
Mm.
I think when you really see people, uh, when you see the goodness in people, that's what helps to change their lives, I think.
Very true. Now, you work in a space where charities are very abundant or very supportive to the work that is being done right now, and also philanthropists and, like you said, families who try to support as much as they can. What charities do you support?
I'm on the board of directors for the Distress Centers of Greater Toronto. So that's the largest crisis line service in the country.
Hmm.
And I passionately believe in the necessity of that level of service as well, relating to something we talked about earlier. Because sometimes in the moment, when people have an impulse and they just need somebody to talk to, we need a well-staffed, well-trained
Right.
group of people who can be there for them any time of day. So I really feel quite passionate about that. But then, as an extension of that as well, I'm also a big supporter of Kids Help Phone here in Canada.
Mm.
I think they just do wonderful work. I used Kids Help Phone when I was a kid, just to talk to somebody, because we take for granted that everybody has a loving family or
Mm.
lots of
Mm.
friends or access to professional counselors or whatever, and they don't, or at least they don't feel like they do. So I think having those sorts of networks of people out there who can connect with people, I think those are incredibly vital services that every country should have.
And as Compassiviste as an organization is multifaceted. So just like we have Compassiviste Dialogues, which you're on now, we also have Compassiviste Foundation, which is a global charity. And we try to find people who are very passionate about what they do and very involved in what they do. And we try to connect with them and bring our audience to what they do in the sense of our audience's passion in that space and try to support them. So I really believe in everything you're doing. And I thank the universe for more people like you every day, and we're surely going to be presenting the stuff that you do so that we can support you and allow you and your organizations and the places that you advocate for to grow, essentially with the help that we can support in the ways that we may support. And finally, thank you very much for this candid conversation. Thank you for being open, honest, critical. And it's very important that you're critical because you've said things that many people shy away from, like you said, because they have to be aware of their corporate position, and they don't want to rock the boat. But you speak truthfully, and I really appreciate and admire that. So thank you for being on the show. It was great having you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, everyone. This is Compassiviste Dialogues.